On its way, and he has a few quarterbacks you shouldn't play. The first guy's Jared Goff of the Los Angeles Rams. Goff's a guy I just can't trust him. I don't know what he's going to do. Each and every week it's a guessing game with him. And this guy, he's still owned in way too many fantasy leagues at 73%. But it seems like every other week he has a big week, is Goff. We saw him in week 11 with a huge game versus Tampa Bay with 30 fantasy points, 376 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 2 windows. And then last week versus a San Francisco team that doesn't do much, 198 yards, 2 windows, 5 rushes, 11 yards, and a fumble loss. So it seems like Goff, in these division matchups, he doesn't do good. And this week he's got another one versus Arizona in Arizona. So I don't think he'll have a great game. He'll get probably 15 to 20 points, which is mediocre. But like I said, this guy, he's had a couple horrible ball games as well this year. And to get 3 points last week's unacceptable. So that's a guy I'm going with and I can't trust. The second guy I'm benching is another guy who's inconsistent and you can't trust. And that's Carson Wentz of the Philadelphia Eagles. He's owned in way too many leagues at 66%. And the last 3 weeks, it's been a train wreck for him. I know he's putting up points, but that's a lot of garbage time points. And that's not always going to be there for Wentz and the Eagles. 215, 2 passing touchdowns. An into 5 rushes, 42 yards. This guy, I'm surprised Philly didn't bench him yet, but the heat is on here. He's got a tough matchup versus Green Bay that gets to the quarterbacks and make plays this season, so I don't like the matchup this week. Wentz, I can't trust him, like I said. He's been poor to mediocre now, his last 4 starts, and this week versus Green Bay, it's a guy I don't want to have it all on my team, and he's a guy I said to drop. There's more consistent options, better quarterbacks, and you just don't want the headache of starting Wentz or having him on your team. Unless you're in a 2-quarterback league, it's a different story, but in normal 10 to 12 team leagues where you start one guy, Carson Wentz, you don't want to start him or have him on your roster. The next guy's Cam Newton. Talk about inconsistency. This guy, he's the front of it, and Newton, he hasn't done much now. His ceiling's been 25 fantasy points this season, and he put in a horrible ball game versus the Arizona Cardinals in Week 12 with 84 passing yards, 46 rushing yards, which saved his day, but he threw 2 interceptions as well. He was only good for 4 fantasy points in that ball game, and he's a guy I can't trust him at all anyway. Cam Newton, I don't like the schedule coming up. I know he's got the Chargers this week, but Joey Bosa, he had 3 sacks last week, and if he could get to Newton early and often, it's going to rattle him, I think. And Newton's another guy I'm just going to stay away from and not have on my roster. And he's owned in way too many leagues as well at 76%. So Cam Newton, bench him. The fourth guy's Matthew Stafford of the Detroit Lions. Stafford, I have him as my ranked 15th quarterback the rest of the way, so check that video out. But anyway, this week I don't like the matchup. He's at Chicago. They give up the 6th least amount of fantasy points to quarterbacks. Stafford's been banged up the whole season with the thumb injury, the back, and he's got the bad thumb on his throwing hand. Last week on that Thanksgiving ball game, he didn't look great versus Houston. 295 yards with a touchdown and into a 2-point conversion and 3 rushing yards. But Stafford, he's just not getting it done right now. He's banged up. The schedule's tough this week, but after that it lightens up a little. And he's a guy, he's still going to have his huge games, don't get me wrong. But just this week, I don't like what he's going to do versus Chicago. I could see him have a similar ball game like he did in Week 11 at Carolina, where he threw for just about 200 yards and then had a touchdown and nothing else. So Stafford, he's a different quarterback on the road as well. And this week it's on the road, so just bench him. And the 5th and final guy I'm benching at quarterbacks, Baker Mayfield. Mayfield here, he's owned in a bunch of leagues as well at 40%. And Mayfield, he just don't get the job done. Last week was the first touchdown he passed since Week 7. So Mayfield last week, 22 fantasy points. Not a bad game versus Jacksonville. This week he versus Tennessee, that gives up the 5th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. But I can't trust Baker. He's owned in about 40% of leagues. And he's a guy I'm staying away from. He's not consistent. You don't have many weapons there. Nick Chubb and Hunt, they're pretty much the whole offense out of the backfield. And I don't trust Baker. So that's 5 quarterbacks I'm looking to bench here heading into Week 13.